Yeah, super happy to see you as always. What I thought I would do today is revisit a little bit what we've been through this past year because it's been so incredibly surprising and unsurprising at the same time. I'll begin with what I've done during this past year, which I suppose not all. Niki, you may know, but I think probably for a lot of the folks here, how many of you have heard about the work that I've been doing on the universal masking front against COVID? Anyone? Marcus and Niki, that's it. Yeah, let me give you a little bit of a quick background. This site over here, which I'll share with you, is the repository for a bunch of work that I co-led. I recruited 4 collaborators in the UK, in France, in Estonia, and in Finland a year ago, over a year ago, actually late February last year, because of my alarm at the fact that here in Hong Kong, in early January, 99% of the population was voluntarily already wearing masks. Back in California, and in the rest of the US and in Europe, not only was nobody talking about the need to wear masks in February and even into March, April, May, further, folks were being told not to wear masks. Folks were being misled with information saying that it was dangerous to wear masks, etc. And so there was this incredible bias all the way at the WHO, the Johns Hopkins, and the CDC. And because of that, I really started pushing this problem. It led to a scientific paper, a white paper, 2 new AI models to show the impact of wearing masks. And it turns out that if 90% of the 90% of the population does not start wearing masks early, then you lose control of the pandemic and you can't suppress it. If only 50% of the population is wearing masks, you may as well not have anybody wearing masks. It makes almost no difference because of the nonlinear behavior of pandemics, which is not intuitive for most non-specialists. The tutorial video I made for one of these simulations, which I designed as an in-browser simulation. Anybody can point their browser to it and run their own simulations. Dial in your own assumptions about how effective masks are or not, and what percentage of the population starts wearing the masks when, and just see what happens. And the tutorial video, the 4-minute video, went kind of viral in thought circles already, led to this massive media coverage starting in May that is the cover of Vanity Fair, and Obama was tweeting the Fox stories that led with our work, and governors in battleground states like Jared Polis in Colorado, and the Hollywood set and so forth. And this was one of the key events that turned 180 degrees the mindset about the need to get everybody masked up against COVID in the US and in Europe. And this went all the way from what you would expect, the MSNBC side, but all the way over to Fox News interviews and pretty much everything else that you can do. In the economy that we published, looking at empirical, it was 100 regions that employed universal masking early and successful suppression of COVID spread, thus bearing out the predictions of our two AI models of the way it spreads. And so this started in late February as a project. I released it in late April. And I'll give you a little bit more of the story for why it took until 3 weeks later for the news to actually try to, to start to make a dent. But I want to show you something that I spoke at already in February or March of last year, before this was even released, because of the battle, the uphill battle that I knew I was going to be fighting against unconscious biases. My area of specialty within AI is, of course, the hardcore AI research for 35 years, pioneering things like Google Translate. But today, applying that work to understanding how, not only how, for example, how does Chinese frame ideas and how can we translate that into English, but also how does English frame ideas? And how does my Californian English frame ideas differently from my uncle in Kansas City English that causes him still not to believe that we need to wear masks, and that not to believe that climate change requires action, and many other things. And so misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and what I call neg information are key areas of my study in not only the technological side of AI, but on the society aspect of AI ethics that I work on very heavily, and how to tackle that. So I knew that I was going up into an uphill battle to shift the mindset because of the a priori biases, the unconscious biases that the US and Europe and the UK came with in terms of their attitude toward masking. And so the reason Tia was on my screen is because in BOMA last February or March, I was asked to give one of the BOMA summit talks on COVID-19. And it's a short talk, about 6 minutes, I think. And I would just like to replay this for you and then do a hindsight dissection of what transpired. And so I'll just go ahead and play it. Let me know if there are any audio problems that you can't hear it for some reason.
Next up, we've got Niki, AI professor, web translation AI pioneer, and Google AI Ethics Council member. Niki, over to you.
Are sick and contagious. Masks are unnecessary. Don't wear masks unless you're medical staff. You need N95 masks to protect yourself. Sip a hot drink every 15 minutes to kill the virus. The coronavirus will remain an Asian problem. We needn't worry. The virus is an escaped Chinese bioweapon. No, it's an escaped American bioweapon. It's the Chinese virus. Chinese eat bats. Misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation are running rampant. Love in the time of coronavirus is scarce, replaced by irrationality, fear, and hatred. The pandemic has been shadowed and increasingly overshadowed by a panicdemic and an infodemic. The AI algorithms that are powering advertising-based news and social media and search continue to generate enormous profits. They're profiting by exploiting us humans. Built-in unconscious biases are cognitive biases. These are biases that evolution hardwired into us. The overconfidence effect, the pseudo-certainty effect, ambiguity effect, Dunning-Kruger effect, bias blind spot. Advertising profit is maximized when AIs prey upon our unconscious. Our civilization, our planetary group of humans, have been joined by AIs who are exponentially amplifying our unconscious groupthink bias. The AIs are encouraging disastrous government responses, especially in democracies. And the AIs are amplifying disastrous mass behavior, false senses of security, panic buying, ineffective preventative measures. The AIs are driving disastrous polarization, both unintentionally as well as via political abuse, amplifying conspiracy theories and racism. The AIs are machine learning the same human unconscious biases that are our Achilles heel, all in the name of profit. We're building AIs to track and fight this, and you can help us to map the misinformation flows, the unconscious cognitive biases they're exploiting, because otherwise, governments make disastrous mistakes, like believing the coronavirus would remain an Asian problem, so the West need not worry too much. You know, social media amplified our representativeness heuristic to make wrong predictions from experience of similar events like SARS, MERS, or Ebola, without realizing we were overestimating its ability to predict accurately. Social media fed our present bias, focusing us on immediate payoffs instead of thinking about future trade-offs a couple of months in the future. And without doing this, AIs drive polarization and hatred with memes like Chinese eat bats causing COVID. Chinese don't eat bats. Some wild game likely transmitted the bat virus. And oh, by the way, wild game is widely eaten in most of the world. But profit-seeking AIs learn to exploit our confirmation bias combined with affinity bias, which biases us towards people like ourselves, and selective perception, where our expectations affect perception. Social media drives polarization and hatred by spreading the Chinese virus meme. AI is preying on our empathy gap. We don't call H1N1 swine flu the American virus, even though the CDC says that's where it started. The AI kicks in our defensive attribution bias to blame someone else as the outcome becomes more and more severe. AI is amplifying framing bias, which misleads us to conclusions based on how a situation or issue is narrowly or metaphorically described. It's leaning in on the reiteration effect, making us believe things via repeated exposure so that familiarity overpowers rationality. Politicians abuse information weaponization to deflect blame. As reported in Nature Medicine, it's not an escaped bioweapon, but politicians can abuse AI to amplify hostile attribution bias, making us unconsciously interpret others' behaviors as having hostile intent. They get AI to feed our belief bias so that we'll rationalize their conspiracy theories. Thanks to our continued influence, in fact, we'll believe previously learned misinformation even after corrections. So that misinformation still influences our inferences. And even worse, AI makes huge profits off of the backfire effect, feeding our unconscious desire when confronted with counter evidence to just double down and strengthen our incorrect beliefs even more. AI propagated misinformation hurts mass behavior. Many of you have read you should sip a hot drink every 15 minutes to wash the virus down and let the stomach acids kill it. You know, sure, staying hydrated is always good, but that does not kill the virus. Colbert called this truthiness. It's the illusory truth effect that makes us believe falsehoods are easier to process. The same effect is propagating disastrous misinformation that masks are mainly for protecting yourself. But guess what? No, everyone should wear masks to stop their own droplets from coughing, sneezing, talking, from infecting others. Masks are mainly to protect your fellow community. So why are governments still saying masks are unnecessary to avoid using up masks instead of encouraging universal mask wearing? What they're doing is they're feeding our reactance, which makes us resist constraints on our freedom of choice. The fact that some successful universal mask wearing strategies were all in Asia, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, feeds our reactive devaluation, where we devalue proposals only because they originated with a perceived adversary. It feeds our not invented here bias because this approach was developed outside our group. We cannot afford to keep letting profit-seeking AIs drive memes that cause disastrous mass behavior. Mask wearers are not sick and contagious. No, mask wearers are selfish and community conscious. All of us need to pitch in, stop AIs from amplifying our unconscious stereotyping and attribution errors. Please help us to teach our bias-fighting AI. Go to dek.ai/unbiased. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was brilliant, Dakai. Thank you so much for that. Talk about having great visuals with the masks. I mean, what a cultural thing, right? To wear a mask. I remember when being in Japan, people would just wear a mask as soon as they started to cough. And in England, if you wear a mask, you know, people will say, well, are you contagious? Even though you're protecting, you know, them from yourself. Right.
Yeah, so let me just go ahead and replace Tia here. I don't know how well that works. So this was something that happened over a year ago, in I think March last year. And what has happened since then? Well, on the one hand, the campaign that I just introduced did work, but it took months. And those months translates to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of needless deaths. The time that we lost on that was absolutely a catastrophe. The other things that people worry about, whether it's 9/11 terrorist attacks or anything like that, like the number of casualties from that pales in comparison. And the loss of that was due to unconscious biases that surfaced even when we were releasing this campaign. So one of the tragic ironies of what happened was that when we released it at the very end of April, it started to go viral on social media, on Facebook, where it was at that time my main social media channel. Started exploding 12 hours after release. Facebook's fake news detection AIs blocked it. They shut down every post that had links to our work, and it went even to Facebook Messenger, so that when people tried to message each other the link, that message just disappeared without a trace. So we talk about censorship in other countries. This was actually happening in our own country, and so the I appealed to this through the processes. 2 weeks went by, not a peep from Facebook, and in a panic because we were seeing massive new deaths every day. I went to senior people at Facebook AI Research, and I said, look, I understand why you're trying to combat fake news. After all, it's something I work on, but this is literally killing people by the droves. And can you do something? They went behind the scenes to their content moderation teams. They did some manual inspection, and then they whitelisted our work. About 3 weeks of delay from the time that we released it. 3 weeks of delay during a time when COVID was spreading exponentially. Literally hundreds of thousands of needless deaths. Caused by, ironically, AIs that were designed to suppress fake news. This is the magnitude of the misinformation problem that we are coping with. This was at a time when the CDC, Johns Hopkins, the WHO were not even recording data on which regions were using universal masking. They were recording which regions were doing social distancing, which regions were doing testing, contact tracing. And so if you record that data, then you can correlate it with success at slowing down COVID. They weren't even collecting the data on masking. This is the level of unconscious bias that we are dealing with. And it's happening across the board. Not just COVID happens to be a great example, but this is happening across the board on crucial issues that have geopolitical impact, including existential threats, both climate change as well as geopolitical tensions, at a time when a lot of the polarization dynamics that we're seeing and the inequality dynamics and many other dynamics are the same, of the same type that we saw preceding World War II and World War I. And we are not in a situation today. Remember, World War II happened before humanity had invented nuclear arms. Today, there is no survivable scenario of another world war breakout. And so we really have our work cut out when it comes to unconscious biases, when we can't even handle COVID properly. What has happened since then? Just last week, this relatively recent video started circulating.
Oh, my apologies. I was wearing my mask because I just got back from a full day of being a good person. I love my mask because it's a simple yet effective way to display my righteousness.
You have to put yourself from the center.
China dropped dead because they were forced to wear masks in gym class? Nope. Am I concerned that we're creating a generation of children who will be socially awkward and conditioned to fear their fellow man? No. Am I concerned that I'm contributing to an impending socialist technocracy that will enslave the global population? Not even a little bit. Am I concerned that my mask is symbolic of my compliance to the social conditioning that will eventually lead to the forced vaccination of every man, woman, and child on planet Earth? Not a chance. And why am I not concerned, you ask? I'm not concerned because I decided a long time ago that shallow, insignificant gestures are a much easier way to showcase my morality than actually being moral. Because in order to be a real good person, I got to stand up to a real bad person. And I don't like standing up to or for anything. I've decided that it's much easier to trick my own mind into thinking compliance is a virtue instead of what compliance actually is, cowardice. I prefer to float through life completely ignorant to the fact that every socialist takeover has always begun in the exact same way, with government overreach, public shaming, censorship, and a toilet paper shortage. Don't believe me? Google toilet paper shortage in communist Russia. Did you think you were having a unique experience? I prefer to pretend history never repeats itself so that I can stand by and turn a blind eye every time history repeats itself. I prefer to call anyone who speaks up, fights back, or stands their ground a lunatic or a conspiracy theorist so that I don't feel obligated to do my own research. Research takes away from me time. And lastly, I prefer to put on my mask and stand among a sea of masks so that I never have to be seen, be free, or reveal the deep, dark shadows that lurk within me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just a moment, please. Okay, thank you. So this is still circulating on social media today, even after all the work that we did. What do you notice about the biases in it?
It's very cynical.
It's very cynical. And what is it propagating? It's propagating more of those unconscious biases that I cataloged in the video that I showed you from the BOMA talk. None of it addresses the science. This is all about ramping up the biases against others, against perceived adversaries, reactants against against compliance, as if analysis of science is compliance. Right? Nothing in it, and this was being circulated on community groups with lots of people jumping in saying, I agree with this 100%. What is the light nature of this battle that we are still fighting? Gallup has been doing polls about this, and about half a year ago, they found in their study that mask use was linked to more accurate perceptions of COVID-19. And the way they did this was they checked people's knowledge of various facts, established empirical facts about COVID. So for example, it's been well determined by science that you can have COVID and you can be asymptomatic and you can still spread COVID. However, those who did not know that fact were much more highly correlated with those who still, despite everything, refuse to wear masks. So they correlated various facts about knowledge of COVID and discovered that those who don't have much knowledge are the same ones who push back against being asked to wear masks. Where is this coming from? There is a study. This is the study by a professor at Dartmouth and economics professor. And what he did was he checked his perception empirically that the news about COVID was all negative. Why was everything he was seeing on television and reading in the newspaper negative? And what he did was he collected hundreds of sources of US and international news. What did he discover? The US is overwhelmingly, at the national news media level, overwhelmingly negative. The stories are 87% negative. There's a bad news bias. And so what we saw, 87% in the national US media was negative. 87% of the news stories. This is compared to only 51% in international media, which is only about half negative, half positive. 53% in regional and local US media. So, city news, city newspapers and city TV stations, and 64% negative in scientific journals, right? And so if you look at this graph over here, showing coverage of COVID from March 2020, roughly when we started our project, all the way through to early this year, what you see is consistently, the red line at the top is the amount of negativity in the national media in the US, which is by far the most influential media within the US. And when you compare that against the blue line at the bottom, which is for the international media, you can see the enormous difference, right? The US national media is not just slightly more negative. It is enormously more negative than almost anything else you can compare it to, whether it's international media, local US media, or scientific journals. And so we're combating a problem right now that is compounded by the incentives in journalism. People often argue that journalism is the best vaccine against misinformation. But the data shows that this is not true. In fact, journalism, at least in the form that it is practiced at the national level in the US, which is by far the most influential, and that it's overwhelmingly biased towards stirring up more fear and more distrust. And distrust is where the conspiracy theories like in that masking video come from. And that same tendency that shows 87% of the news to be negative is then picked up and driven on social media by the AIs that power social media. And today, far more Americans, and this is true for other countries as well, and studies have shown far more Americans consume news through social media rather than actually tuning in to the TV station or picking up the newspaper. Instead, they get their links to the Fox News clips or the CNN clips or the New York Times articles through their social media feed or their Twitter feed. And this is why even 87% negative is still underestimating the amount of negativity in our media sphere. 87% is for the original traditional news media sources. That then gets further amplified by the social media AIs that actually are the delivery channel of that content to the population. So in summary, we've identified the bias problem over a year ago, dropped everything to work on that problem because of the hundreds of thousands, millions now of deaths from COVID, and the urgency of that problem to overcome the bias. And frustratingly today are still seeing the effects of that bias fed by the national media, amplified by social media AI that targets all those hundreds of unconscious cognitive biases that I outlined, leading to videos like the one I showed you that are now arguing that getting a vaccine is also somehow mindless compliance instead of social responsibility. I'm sorry not to have a more positive message for you. We are working on the AI technology, on the natural language processing technology, on the computational social science technology, and on public awareness of the bias problem. It is even more of an uphill battle. It won't stop us from fighting it, but it demands much, much greater efforts and attention. So I'll just stop there and take any questions.
I have a spontaneous thought, and I feel like, so I was in advertising for many years, and it was very clear the power of headlines, right? This is when you're in advertising, you distinguish between headline, body copy, illustration, and logo. It's kind of the architecture, the anatomy of advertising, and the importance of headline. And of course, headlines and news go together because news are written below headlines. And the saying, the famous saying, only bad news or good news, basically shaped the media as it is today. And when I listen to you, I feel like, hey, there should be a shift of paradigm, and we should go out. I'm going to post this later. We should go out and everyone should post out in their social medias only good news or good news. Because I think we should stop growing fear and anxiety. It's always a bad companion for making future decisions. You never make good decisions in fear and anxiety. So that's my thought. It's not really a question. It's just like something that popped up in my brain when I was listening to you. And thank you for the update. And yeah, next time, good news, please. I'm opening up. Karen.
Yeah, I have a question, maybe a thought or a comment. I'm speaking from Tallinn, from Estonia. So in Estonia, the population is, can you hear me now? Okay, yeah, I had to take my AirPods out. Population is nearly 30% Russian. We border with Russia. And I think around 30% of the country has said they have no intention of getting the vaccine. And it correlates very strongly with the Russian media outlets and the way they portray the Western influence and whatever. So in your international analysis, does that include countries such as Russia, or have you done any specific research into how different regions or specific, maybe sanctioned countries speak about the COVID?
Yeah, in fact, we were just discussing this earlier today. The study that I showed you was done by an American professor at Dartmouth, and as far as we can tell, we're double checking this with him. That data that he collected on news, international news, and so forth was all in English. The sentiment analysis, natural language processing technology that he was using was developed for English. I think it would be really interesting. In fact, we were talking about this earlier with Indians and with Chinese and with others to get an initial feel of how people's impressions were about their media sources. And I think it is, for sure, there is a big contrast. Sometimes the contrast boils down to whether the news is specifically about politics or government issues. I had a number of answers that said for various regions like India, the news is very positive when it comes to government or politics. And for everything else, it's extremely negative. And that has to do with the funding structure, the funding, they said, coming from government.
Okay, thank you.
Well, else, Marcus, what are your thoughts? You're muted, by the way.
Sorry, I was just looking at the UK statistics, which are being bandied around, and I think it's something like 90% of over 50s have now received their first or second vaccinations. So somehow it looks as if we read the data correctly, and I guess this is the thing about the bias, isn't it, Niki?
Yeah. Yes.
It's that the material which we're getting is biased to us without realizing it. And that's the whole point about this unconscious bias, isn't it? In your opinion, are there any, how are we going to combat this?
So this, I think this is actually the Achilles heel of our current system, is that the profit incentives, not just in news media, not just in social media, you know, in advertising-driven social media recommendation AIs, but you know, also in politics and also in marketing. People are actually taught how to exploit unconscious biases.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I, like probably many of you, have an MBA. Mine happens to be from Kellogg, which is known for marketing. And, you know, we were literally being taught how to how to exploit people's unconscious biases.
Yeah.
To something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's sort of the opposite of training a population on critical thinking, on scientific method, on rationality. And so one has to ask, in the era of AI, where, you know, these problems are age old, but what's different, what's changed, is that AI is now holding an exponential amplifier to all of this. And so the traditional checks and balances, which never worked that well, are just completely broken now. And that's why we're seeing all this polarization in many of the countries that we live in, as well as geopolitically. People are unaware that, you know, like, so when various elections or referenda, you know, happened, when, for example, say Brexit happened, or when Trump won in 2016, there was all this surprise in various circles, right? So in democratic circles in the US, there was enormous surprise. Nobody could believe that that was happening, because everybody had been stuck by their own social media engines to be hearing only the things that they thought. And so, like, nobody could imagine that there was half the country that was thinking the polar opposite, because social media AIs have been building essentially walled cities that silo our populations into different silos who are unaware of each other. And the same thing, you know, as you know, I'm fortunate to constantly leap back and forth between Hong Kong and Berkeley, where I've joint appointments, and also very often to Europe, where I have a lot of collaboration. And so I can see, because I'm jumping from one silo to the next, just how incredibly different the depth of coverage is. How little folks in the US or in Europe actually know about what's going on in Hong Kong or in China.
Yeah.
It's tiny what people know. And what really surprises me is how incredibly confident or overconfident those Americans or Europeans are that they know what's going on. Even when lecturing at me, someone who has been based in Hong Kong for 30 years and seen everything happen since the British were colonizing Hong Kong.
How much would you say that the Chinese are transparent with information?
Mm-hmm.
How much would you say the Chinese government is transparent with information?
Yeah, so that's, again, a question that I would, you know, in the same way the Indians responded to the question, what I would say is that if it doesn't involve national security issues, which to China means if it doesn't involve destabilizing the country, the government, you know, if it doesn't risk some kind of civil war, then things are actually very open. I'm always surprised how much more about Europe and the US my mainland Chinese university students know than even my European and American students. It's remarkable how much they know. They also know enough not to necessarily trust the party line in the media when it comes to China.
I think that we also have this issue that we don't trust our intuition. I think a lot of people intuitively have a different thought than what they read in media, but they don't trust their intuition. I don't know what you think about that.
It depends on how much they think they know. So the thing is the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? The Dunning-Kruger effect that I mentioned is how when people know nothing, then they just say, oh, I know nothing about, you know, that topic. When people learn a little bit, then suddenly they think that they're really expert. And then when they start learning more and more and more, by the time they get to a PhD level of knowledge about that subject, they are back to, oh my God, we know nothing at all, because they see all the complexity and all the nuance and all the lack of simple answers, right? And so this is the problem, is that, you know, when you first, this is why there's that old saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? Because when you have a little knowledge, you think you know everything, but you don't know what you don't know. And this is, you know, really the problem. And when it, you know, one thing that I see, you know, I'm constantly confronted with, because my university actually also, we are by far the most American style international university in the entire region. We have tons of exchange students all the time, except during COVID, from America, from Europe, all the, you know, and all over the world. And I'm always struck by how little they know about China in comparison with how much the Chinese students know about the US or Europe. It's very asymmetric. And it is like heavily because there is a lot of information circulating in China about US news, about European news, and it goes into depth. Whereas the news that I see about China or Hong Kong in the US or Europe is extremely shallow. It's extremely full of one journalist just repeating what the other journalist said. A lot of journalists that write for these or report for these, you know, Western media that are based here in Hong Kong don't even speak Chinese. And I'm constantly flabbergasted by that. I'm thinking, like, can you imagine posting a journalist to France who doesn't speak French, and yet is regarded as an expert on France back in their home turf? And that is what is happening in the media. But again, because of unconscious bias, everybody in the US and Europe is very happy to accept that these reporters know what they're talking about.
Niki, we've hit the top of the hour. I have the church bell behind me, which reminds me that I'm also marshal of time and responsible and respectful for your time. Thank you so much for this hour, and thank you so much for the insights. Thank you so much for shaking us up again. I think it's important to get back to where we should put our focus on. Yeah,
Thank you.
Yes.
A real pleasure as always, and I really hope that we can hopefully soon reconvene in physical format.
Yes, can't meet to be together and give a hug. I don't know who of you is missing hugs. I absolutely miss hugs. I'm a big hugger. Niki, a virtual hug to you. Thank you so much for everything.
Stay in touch. Stay safe.
Thank
Stay
you.
well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.